Back in late 2006, some investigators from our Economic Crimes Bureau came to my office. I was acting as the chief legal counsel for Miami-Dade Police Department, and came to my office and told me about something they've been discovering. Properties that were either dilapidated or not really worth anything were being sold for $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 and then going right into foreclosure because the folks that were selling these properties or buying these properties, the folks that were buying them refused to make the payments and let them go right into foreclosure. And what was happening, the phenomenon was folks were taking properties that were worth a whole lot less, artificially inflating the values, selling them at that price, splitting the money with what they call a straw buyer, a person that was just acting as a purchaser, splitting the money knowing full well that that purchaser was never going to pay the bank back the money. And at that period of time, the banks were very, very free and easy with providing any type of financial assistance, a mortgage. There were no document loans. There were no verification loans. There were all kinds of loans that were available to folks to actually do this. And once they found out they can do this, law enforcement didn't know how to attack this problem because there's a property. Is it a fraud? No, it's not really a fraud because you needed a certain amount of criteria to consider that to be a fraud. Is it a theft? Well, the property is still there, so they're not really stealing the property. So we didn't have a tool to allow law enforcement to get involved and be able to handle this type of crime, which kind of the Miami-Dade area was the epicenter, city of Miami. If you looked back in the day in 2007, 2008, they used to say the state bird was the crane because there were so many cranes over the city of Miami building all these big, gigantic condominium complexes that were going up as the value of the properties were being increased. But there was nothing behind the increase in the values. They were all artificially being increased because what they were doing is rolling them over, selling them, pocketing the money, foreclosing on the property, moving on, doing it again, selling, having one sale, 2 weeks later having another sale, $50,000 increase between the weeks go by. Everybody's putting money in their pocket and the banks weren't getting paid. No one was making payments to the bank for the mortgages that were being given out freely. So I was able to go to Tallahassee with this information from our investigators and created and drafted a bill which was entitled the Mortgage Fraud Bill or Mortgage Fraud itself. Brought that piece of legislation to some of our local legislators to go ahead and file that bill up in Tallahassee. And going up there and lobbying and working with the legislators, answering questions and doing all those things, was able to get the bill, after it was drafted, redrafted, and then redrafted and modified a third time, was able to get the bill to the floor, get it voted on, get it passed in the House, brought it over to the Senate, was able to get it passed and have the governor have a signing ceremony for us back in 2007. And that became the first statute in the mortgage fraud arena here in Florida. Using that as the cornerstone for our mortgage fraud task force, we started the task force, began investigating the crimes, and also started making arrests for those crimes. At the time, and just to get it passed through the legislature, I was learning as I was going because I had never done this before, and as I was going through the process, you wanted to get the piece of legislation as intact as you possibly could and get it passed, because if you fought for one thing or fought for another and it didn't get passed, it really didn't matter. So knowing that, the second year, back in 2008, went back to the legislature and asked the legislature to enhance the penalties. Instead of making it a third-degree felony, let's make it a second-degree felony and enhance the penalties because this was such a big problem in South Florida. And fortunately for us, Marco Rubio, who was our local legislator, he was the Speaker of the Florida House at that time, he took our bill and made it a Speaker's priority bill. And with armed as a Speaker's priority bill, we were through the House in less than 3 weeks after session started, and it was over into the Senate. It was voted on and passed and signed by the governor in the middle of session. Prior to anything, we were one of the first bills to actually get passed and signed by the governor as law and as the enhancement to the mortgage fraud bill in Florida. We wouldn't have been able to do that had it not been for Marco making it a priority of the Speaker and getting the legs on the bill that we needed to. So then after we had an enhanced penalty, a second-degree felony for mortgage fraud, folks from D.C. and throughout the country were interested in what we were doing and how we set up the task force down here and what we're using as legislative tools to help law enforcement do their job. They wanted me to go up to D.C. and to work on the bills to create a nationwide mortgage fraud task force and allow the federal government to work with the state and locals and do the enforcement actions that we were doing here in Florida, and in particular South Florida. That's how we got to the federal arena, and I was able to work with a number of congressmen and senators up in D.C. to help draft the bill. I said the actual story, how this all came about. My boss, Director Parker, who was the sheriff of Miami-Dade County at the point in time, he and I went to Washington, D.C. to go discuss what we're doing in South Florida and discuss that with some of the representatives and senators up in D.C. and their staffers, and let them know what we're doing here, what's creative, what's innovative, and what we think would work in other places throughout the country. And one of the first meetings that we had with a congressman was a congressman from Michigan, who was a former trooper, a state trooper. And as I began explaining the mortgage fraud task force and the mortgage fraud bills, and he became very interested. And he said, "Hey, do you think you could draft something for federal legislation?" And I looked at my boss and I said, "What do you think?" And he goes, "Absolutely." So I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity, and I said, "Yeah, that would be great. When do you need it?" And he said, "Tomorrow." So this was the first meeting we had at 8 o'clock in the morning. We had meetings scheduled throughout Capitol Hill all the way through 7 o'clock at night, and I'm trying to figure myself, how am I going to draft a bill from 7 o'clock at night and still get some sleep and then start our meetings at 8 o'clock the next day? Well, it got done. I worked all the way through the night till about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I woke up. There was about 9,500 Z's because I had pressed the button as I fell asleep on my computer. But I was able to draft something to bring into his office and bring into bill drafting. And then also during that same day, we were discussing with our local congressmen, with other senators, other representatives from D.C. About what we were doing, and they were all interested and they all wanted to get on board because they had not realized what a problem this was, the mortgage fraud problem, not only in Florida but throughout the country. And the impetus for the bill started as simple as, "Hey, can you draft a bill?" And then the next thing you know, we're going through the House of Representatives and watching it on C-SPAN and watching us get the votes that we actually passed a bill and having it sent over to Senate. So those are things that I will remember for the rest of my life as being able to accomplish something that is going to affect and has affected hundreds of thousands of people in a good way, and being able to stop the financial crisis that was started by the easy money and the fraudsters that saw the easy money and took advantage of it.